In the middle of the 20th century, the stage was set for a multitude of mysterious flying ships to appear in the sky. Was it a cultural phenomenon, reflecting man's interest in space? Were they secret military prototypes, built with the newest technologies at the time? Or were they visitors from outer space? The answer would be easy if it weren't for the fact that archaeologists and historians have found depictions of such phenomena dating back centuries. No, make that millennia. The British Airways Boeing was just starting a long turn over Labrador. Captain James Howard and his co-pilot Francis Lehman Boyd noticed a long metallic object in the clear sky. The two pilots couldn't tell how big it was. Boyd contacted the Goose Bay Control Tower to ask if any other aircraft were flying in the vicinity, and was told that there weren't any. Boyd was hardly surprised. In his opinion, this object and the smaller craft that was flying with it were not man-made. They had to be some of those flying saucers that the press had been talking about for a few years. He had always been skeptical of all those stories about Martians, but that night in 1954, all doubts were erased from his mind. Flying saucers really did exist. Unidentified flying objects. Some people think they're visitors from outer space, while others think they're hallucinations or errors in interpreting what was seen. Who's right? People have been saying for ages that they saw strange things in the sky. An Egyptian scroll from the days of Pharaoh Thutmose III speaks of a ball of fire, 5 meters wide, that flew across the sky 35 centuries ago. In the Bible, a star guided the wise men to Christ's manger. In August 1566, a local newspaper in Basel, Switzerland, reported that black spheres were seen flying towards the sun at an amazing speed.
UFOs have been reported throughout history, especially in Canada where we've done most of our research. We've been able to look into historical records and found as long ago as 1663 or 1662, when Jesuit missionaries were speaking with some of the First Nations people in what is now Quebec, they reported many very interesting things. They were very good at recording scientific concepts, what was going on in the area at the time, the geology, the astronomy. And at that time, in one of their diaries, they reported that they had seen and witnessed fiery serpents, as they described, along with many of the people in the villages that they were staying in. That these fiery serpents moved through the sky in unexplained manners, balls of light that seemed to dance through the heavens, and they had no explanation for what they had seen.
As far as most scientists are concerned, these wild stories are exaggerated accounts of well-known astronomical activities such as comets, meteorites, and aurora borealis. Man's lack of knowledge in the past regarding these naturally occurring phenomena led to individuals imagining that they were seeing incredible crafts flying in the air. In 1897, strange airships that looked like Zeppelins were seen flying over the United States. This was 6 years before the famous first flight of the Wright brothers. No explanation was ever found for these mysterious airships.
In 1915, over Parliament Hill, many flying lights, the sounds of airplanes moving in the sky were reported by many people in the surrounding area, in Brockville, Ottawa, throughout the entire valley. And because it was very close to the war at that time, they were concerned that perhaps we were going to be invaded. We were in danger of Canada itself being drawn into the war by some invading force. So this caused such concern among the government and among the population, and they contacted the police, that they actually killed the lights. They turned off the lights of Parliament Hill to black them out so that they would not be a target for any invaders.
On June 24, 1947, Kenneth Arnold, an American civil pilot, reported having seen 9 objects flying in formation like a flock of geese while he was over Mount Rainier in Washington State.
Kenneth Arnold was one of the first people to come forward with a statement that he had seen flying saucers. Now, he did not himself say they were saucers. In fact, he said that they were more crescent-shaped, but they moved like saucers skimming across the water. And journalists at the time connected this together and called them flying saucers. He was at the time on a mercy mission looking for a lost aircraft that had itself gone down, and he was with a group or a number of individuals searching for this particular aircraft.
Over the next few days, strange objects flying in the air were reported throughout America. Then they began to appear in Europe as well. When asked, scientists came up with rational explanations. They had to be cases of hallucinations, mass hysteria, or simple atmospheric phenomena. In other words, they had no idea.
In June 1954, the crew and many passengers aboard British Airways Boeing 377 Stratocruiser saw a large group of unknown objects flying over Labrador, Canada. When they landed in Goose Bay to refuel, Captain James Howard and his co-pilot Francis Lehman Boyd were questioned by representatives of the Canadian and U.S. Air Forces. They were told that similar observations had also been reported by others in the area. When they arrived in London the next day, Howard and Boyd had to report to the British Ministry of Defence, which proved that even back then, UFOs were being taken seriously.
Today, 60 years after the modern era of UFOs first began, the phenomenon remains as puzzling as it was back then. As soon as they began to appear in 1947, flying saucers, as they were called in those days, aroused the curiosity of the public, then of scientists and the military. We're still not sure exactly what UFOs are. On the other hand, we do know what they aren't. Today, when we speak of UFOs, most people immediately associate the expression with alien spacecraft. But this wasn't always the case, and this association is being increasingly questioned.
Back in 1947, most people did not consider that the flying saucers that were being observed were alien spacecraft. Certainly it was popularized by some, but at the most part it was described as perhaps a Russian secret weapon. The Russians had developed something that was going to be tested over the United States, and they were worried about that, and that is why the government and military became involved. They were certain that they were perhaps an enemy vessel of some sort, an enemy device that was being tested.
It was the beginning of the Cold War. Flying saucers intrigued high-ranking military officials. There was speculation that they might be extraterrestrial vehicles, but that theory was kept secret. From the 1950s on, the alien theory gradually became the most popular way to explain these mysterious flying saucers.
Ufology as a science, or perhaps it is really an art, has gone through several cycles, and it is dependent very greatly on the personal bias of the individual doing the research. There are individuals who believe that aliens are responsible for the flying saucers, and some who absolutely refuse to consider that in any way. Others fall in between. Perhaps some are unusual natural phenomena, perhaps some are a spiritual phenomena, and there are others whose interests and speculations lie somewhere beyond that.
Although the psychosocial approach appeals to some intellectuals, it is not widely accepted. If most of the occurrences were nothing more than the product of someone's imagination, then how do you explain encounters of the second kind? Sightings where there was a visible impact on the environment. In Montreal on January 6, 1977, Mrs. Florida Malbeuf was sitting in her kitchen in the middle of the night. From where she was sitting, she could see something that looked like a large plate, 5 meters wide, landing on the roof of a building across the street. She couldn't believe her eyes, but something was definitely happening. Suddenly, she saw 2 figures moving towards the edge of the roof. She was too far away to make out their features, but they appeared to be dressed in white one-piece jumpsuits.
One of them got out of the spaceship and went to the edge of the roof. He looked up and down, left and right. Then he went back into the spaceship, but there were 2 of them.
Soon afterwards, Mrs. Malbeuf saw the flying saucer again. This time it rose up into the air, headed south, and quickly disappeared into the distance. Thinking that someone might be playing a cruel joke on her, Mrs. Malbeuf decided not to call the police. The next day she confided in her son André, who decided to climb up on the neighbor's roof. Despite the cold weather, there was a 6-meter wide circle where the snow had melted. He called the police, who refused to come and investigate. Reporters seemed much more interested in the story.
When I met Andre, he told me that he had been up on the roof with the cameraman. They took some pictures and there seemed to be some indentation. So we decided that a group of us would go up onto the roof and see what it was all about. So when we got up onto the roof, we looked around and we could see there was this kind of an indentation in one area, some melted snow and sort of a circular type of area. Walking around, we noticed there looked like small little footprints in some area. So we cut out a piece of ice, brought it down, put it in the fridge, and I don't recall what happened to it, but we took some pictures and some measurements and documented it for later use.
The footprints looked like they were made by boots. Each one was 16 centimeters long and 4 centimeters wide.
I think a day or 2 later I had come back with a Geiger counter. There was no traces of radiation. There was no chemicals in the snow. There was nothing that could indicate there was something strange in that area, other than the melted ice, which could have been caused by something we assume very hot to melt it as like that.
Although the Malbeuf case was investigated by ufologists, no explanation was ever found. A mysterious circle also appeared in the Sainte-Marie de Mont-Noir case. At dawn on November 20th, 1989, Yvon Noiseux was awakened by a blue light shining into his bedroom. He glanced outside and saw 4 rectangular-shaped lights hovering in the air 100 meters away from him, just above his neighbor's house across the street. The incident only lasted a brief moment, then the 4 lights disappeared, all at once. They soon reappeared, just as bright as before, but they had moved slightly to the west. The lights repeated this pattern 3 times before disappearing for good. At the same time, Daniel Galarneau, who lived in the house over which the lights were hovering, was awakened by an unusual noise.
I was woken out of my sleep by a noise. It was like a buzzing noise. I got up, or rather I sat up in bed, and I noticed that all the objects in the house had a bluish tinge to them, as if they were giving off blue neon sparks. I remember thinking how bright the light was inside the house. As I recall, the buzzing noise lasted about 12 seconds.
Yvonne Oiseux and Daniel Galarneau are only two of many witnesses who saw strange lights that morning over Sainte-Marie-de-Mont-Noir, a small town southeast of Montreal.
We noticed a circle behind my house on the property next to mine, a perfect circle, in a field where the grass was dried out like hay, since it wasn't usually taken care of. The grass was maybe 3 or 4 feet high, and there, in the middle of the field, was this circle where the grass had been totally flattened.
The circle was 20 meters wide, and the grass within the circle had turned green as if in summer. The eyewitnesses contacted the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who sent Sergeant Antonio D'Angelo to investigate.
All of the grass outside of the circle was yellow, like hay, and about a foot high. But inside the circle, the grass was very green. We measured the circle, and it was 65 feet wide. But it wasn't an exact circle. I checked all around the circle, and there were no trace of any footprints. It was as if something had rested on top of it, like a fan.
9 weeks after the incident, grass and soil samples were sent to the Department of Agriculture at Laval University, where they were analyzed by Dr. Jacques Debroux. His results were astonishing.
From the analysis, we can see that chemical levels in the grass were twice as high within the circle. For instance, chlorophyll levels were 10 times as high, and nitrogen levels were twice as high compared to the grass outside of the circle. Given that the samples were taken in the middle of the winter, in February, I can't find any explanation for this difference between the results inside the circle versus outside of it.
9 months after the incident, a second analysis was performed using new samples of soil and vegetation. The results still showed unusually high levels of nitrogen and chlorophyll. Researchers also noted the growth of a plant that was not typically found in this environment. The circle on the ground in Sainte-Marie-de-Mont-Noir remained visible for a long time.
The mark stayed visible for, I would say, at least 3 years, until the property next to mine was sold and the grass began to be maintained and cut regularly.
Of course, the Malbeuf and Sainte-Marie-de-Mont-Noir cases don't necessarily mean we have to accept the alien theory. In May of 1967, the Canadian Forces tasked Captain Paul Bisky to investigate a strange occurrence in Manitoba's Whiteshell Provincial Park involving Stefan Michalak. One morning a few days earlier, something happened after Stefan Michalak left his motel on the Trans-Canadian Highway. A Canadian of Polish origin, Michalak worked as a mechanic for a Winnipeg-based company, but his true passion lay in prospecting. On this beautiful Saturday morning, he decided to walk to Falcon Lake and explore the area.
In 1967, he had a remarkable experience where during lunchtime, in a clear blue sky, he had seen 2 disc-shaped objects descending from the sky. One remained in the air while the other appeared to land on a very flat rock near him. He watched it for some time. Very bright lights were shining out of the opening. He thought he heard voices coming out of a small door. He walked up, touched the side, and it was so hot that it actually burned his glove. He saw inside this doorway flashing lights, and all of a sudden this doorway shut. The entire object rotated, so there was an exhaust vent right in front of him. Out of it shot a very hot blast of gas, which set his clothes on fire, burned him severely with second and third degree burns, and the object rose. He eventually made it back to civilization, where he was treated at hospitals, and the case was investigated very thoroughly by the Royal Canadian Air Force, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, civilian investigators, a number of other agencies, and was even investigated by the United States Air Force, so that in its report to the Condon Committee, headed by Edward Condon, they classified this case as unexplained. There was no explanation for what he has said happened to him.
The Michalak case has a number of detractors. Many investigators believe that the amateur prospector could have made up the whole story, but their arguments are hard to accept.
One would then have to say, if the case is a hoax, what about all the other phenomena? How would he burn himself in this manner? What about some of the additional evidence found at the site? The radiation, the silver bars that were located. It's very difficult to explain unless it's a very elaborate hoax. And if it was a very elaborate hoax, it was of the extent that he certainly didn't make any money from it. It caused him and his family great inconvenience over decades. And I really question why he would have made that up at all.
The Michalak case, considered to be the most significant in the history of Canadian UFO research, raised strong feelings on all sides. Even today, some pages of the file are still marked confidential. Based on that, it's not much of a stretch to infer that the authorities might know more than they are letting on. When the first sightings of flying saucers were reported in the press, American military authorities began to wonder about them. It was the beginning of the Cold War, and these mysterious craft might just be part of the Soviet threat.
Le projet Blue Book, c'est la troisième version.
Project Blue Book was the third in a series of UFO studies conducted by the U.S. Air Force.
Donc, en 1952.
In 1952, Project Grudge was discontinued, and a decision was made to provide the public with the truth about flying saucers.
On va faire du vrai travail avec soi-disant des moyens pour donner la vérité au public sur les soucoupes volantes. Et en fait, de fil en aiguille, à part...
But other than the first few years, when Captain Ruppel tried to get to the truth, Project Blue Book ended up merely filtering information and playing down the importance of events, providing the public with debunking reports and general disinformation.
Dédramatiser au maximum, donner des comptes rendus lénifiants à tout le monde et surtout donc entrer dans ce type de désinformation générale, disant qu'en fait...
It didn't matter if 25,000 people saw flying saucers, or if they appeared on radar or film. The government continued to tell the public that they were just a hallucination. They didn't exist.
In 1969, the U.S. Air Force officially put an end to its investigation of UFOs.
In Canada, UFO investigation at an official level took a slightly different track. At one point, there was a project called Project Magnet in the 1950s, which was studied at the national defense level by an individual working in the National Defense Department, but on very low funding. Some meetings were held. It seemed as though nothing was really formulated well. It was extended through the National Research Council and by individuals and under the aegis of something called Project Second Story.
Similar studies were carried out in France, England, and Russia, as well as a half-dozen countries in South America. A simple glance at all of these studies shows that in most cases the authorities were just as dumbfounded as the public. We can also see that perhaps the only true conspiracy lies in the fact that while they didn't understand exactly what the UFOs were, some agencies chose to use their shroud of mystery to conceal their secret activities.
In 1997, the CIA published an article in its in-house journal, Studies in Intelligence, entitled CIA's Role in the Study of UFOs 1947 to 1990. The article, written by CIA historian Gerald Haynes, discussed the CIA's involvement in UFO investigations. The article stated that many UFO sightings that had officially been classified unexplained by military authorities were in fact test flights of secret prototypes like the U-2 spy plane or the SR-71 Blackbird. When the U-2 was first designed, it had a silver body that made it very shiny while in flight. For an observer at ground level, this bright light high in the sky, higher than conventional planes, had to be one of those flying saucers. According to CIA documents, there were so many sightings like this that they made up at least 50% of all reported cases classified as unexplained between 1960 and 1969, the year that American inquiry commissions stopped investigating UFOs.
If we accept the possibility that some of these incidents are genuinely attributable to visitors from outer space, then what do they want? Staunch believers in alien visitors have a simple answer to that question. They want to use us as guinea pigs. In August 2005, a group of teens went camping at Lake La Croche in Quebec. Around 9 p.m., while 11-year-old Tricia was sleeping, the older kids gathered around the fire. Kathleen Bellemare and her friend Stéphane Veillette saw a ball of light moving over the lake. Next came blue, red, and yellow balls that danced above the astounded onlookers.
The longer my boyfriend and I watched it, the more it moved around. Then I saw the ball of light move right behind us in the woods. It got bigger and bigger as it approached us. Then I woke up my friend Tricia so that she could see it too. But by the time she arrived, it was so big that it scared us, and we got back into the truck.
The next day, they went back to the same campsite. And just like the night before, Kathleen and Stéphane saw strange balls of light dancing over the lake. A few days later, Kathleen contacted Pauline Mongrain, who was well known in the area for her avid interest in UFOs.
To tell you the truth, I was quite fascinated and quite surprised by what I heard, since there were several elements and several witnesses involved. So after that, I was going to... Unfortunately, I couldn't go to the site myself since one of my parents was dying at the time. One of the witnesses told me, "Hey, I'm going to go back there in a day or two." I said, "Okay." Then she said, "I took a roll of pictures while we were up there." So I said, "Bring me the roll of pictures and we'll try to have them developed and see if we can figure out what you guys saw up there." I had the first roll of pictures developed, but it was a waste of time. There was nothing on them, nothing at all. They were completely black. She had taken the pictures with a 35mm camera using a flash. So I said to her, "Look, if you do decide to go back there in 2 or 3 days' time, then take a digital camera with you. Since you'll be in the dark in the woods on top of a mountain, you'll have a better chance of taking some good pictures." And that's exactly what she did.
Kathleen and Stéphane returned to the lake in early September. It wasn't long before the campers began to see strange lights again. Then, one of the spears headed toward them and moved around their campsite. Frightened, the teens hopped into a car and drove to the nearest phone to call the police. But the manager thought that they were high on drugs and wouldn't let them use the phone. Annoyed, they decided to return to their campsite. They found an odd white substance on the roof of a van. It was like powder, and it was everywhere. The next day, as they were headed towards La Tuque, Kathleen and Stéphane were followed by a patrol car. It pulled them over. One of the officers approached Kathleen's car and asked her to produce her driver's license. Another officer went to the passenger side of the car and asked Stéphane for ID as well. It was 7:45 p.m. Kathleen tried to get a look at the police officer who was going through Stéphane's papers, but the officer on her side of the car indicated that she wasn't to turn her head. The young woman thought the constables were acting very strangely.
The witnesses said that the police officers were dressed in outdated uniforms. They were wearing these old-looking uniforms. The uniforms just didn't look like what you usually see these days. And their eyes, they had slanted eyes, large slanted eyes. The phone that they used to make a call surprised me too. It was big and black, like something from the past as well.
The light on their car was turning a lot faster than most patrol cars. When the police officer finally gave her back her ID, the clock on the dashboard read 11 p.m. 4 hours had passed, but Kathleen felt like it had only been a few minutes. What was even stranger was that just before the police stopped them, the couple had filled up the gas tank. And now it read empty.
She left La Tuque at about 6:45 p.m. She was intercepted by the police at about 7:45, and she arrived home at 12:45 a.m., which is not normal. The entire trip from La Tuque to her house should have taken about an hour and a half, so there's definitely some missing time.
More puzzled than ever by the events they had experienced, the witnesses went back to see Pauline Mongrain.
I went back to the site with Kathleen. She showed me exactly where the phenomena had occurred. That was when I noticed strange tracks on the ground. The ground was pretty soft, and we could see partial footprints, 2 heels and toe prints, just the toes. We came back and took the second roll of pictures in to be developed, and this time they turned out pretty good. Okay, so there were spots on the pictures. We knew that the spots could be nothing more than condensation, given the atmosphere in which the pictures were taken high up in the mountains where the air was cool. And they were taken at night. But we did see some dots of light, red and blue, that could not be explained. So I sent those pictures to some members of the Quebec UFO Association for analysis to see what they could make of them.
Pauline Mongrain tried to document the strange police incident. When she checked with authorities, she was told that the police hadn't pulled anyone over that night between Lake Lacroche and La Tuque. On the other hand, many local residents confirmed having seen strange lights in the sky. Investigators from the Quebec Ufology Association decided to try regression therapy using hypnosis to discover what was hidden in the teens' memories.
Tricia was totally fascinated by the sighting that occurred on the first night, which was August 28th. She made a drawing of what she had seen. Kathleen made a drawing of what she had seen as well, and I was amazed to see how similar the two drawings were.
This regression session revealed an amazing story. Kathleen and Tricia had both been abducted and taken aboard an alien spaceship. These abductions happened twice. Tricia was abducted the first night, and Kathleen was abducted during the police incident.
At first, I saw myself on a table that was like stainless steel, strapped down, completely naked, and I was cold. I could really feel the sensation of being cold while I was under hypnosis, while I was telling the whole story. Then there were these two people who I couldn't see very well because it was dark. They took me by the arm and led me into this big room where there were like a lot of bright lights and complicated computers, very high-tech. I felt like I was dreaming, but it was real. There were a lot of people in that room, and they were all pointing at me and suspending me in the air. I was floating motionless in the air.
In the second room, Kathleen described the beings who had abducted her. Odd creatures that were anything but human.
I would say that they were like average height with big gray feet, big gray hands, big eyes and a small mouth that you could barely see. And the texture of their skin, well, it was like clammy. It was kind of shiny, you know.
Alien abductions. It sounds ludicrous, doesn't it? But this phenomenon has grown so big that it is now impossible to talk about UFOs without adding a discussion on this topic. What should we believe? How valuable is hypnosis in cases like this? Who are these people? Guinea pigs used for bizarre experiments? Or victims of a terrible hallucination or nightmare?
Since the 1970s, the topic of alien abductions has been at the forefront of all debates over UFOs. The stories, which started back in the late 1950s, are always basically the same. A person traveling in a remote area sees a strange light in the sky. Then, after the UFO has left, the person is upset to learn that a period of time varying from a few minutes to a few hours has been erased from their memory. They seek help, and generally, under hypnosis, tell an extraordinary tale of being led aboard a mysterious spaceship where tests are performed on them. Kathleen's story follows that same pattern.
I am very intrigued by the abduction phenomena. On the one hand, it seems absurd that people could have creatures come into their bedrooms and take them through solid walls aboard spacecraft. On the other hand, if we are allowed to speculate, one of the characteristics of an examination of a culture by anthropologists is to study from afar, take specimens, observe them, and put them back. So this is exactly what could be expected by an alien anthropologist. Perhaps Earth is being investigated and studied by Anthropology 101 at a university on Mars or something like that. As speculation, that's perfectly valid. The evidence does not prove this in any way. Although I have had many people come to me through the years with stories, very, very sincere individuals. What are we to make of this? Is it possible that we are looking at a new psychological or sociological phenomenon? If so, they should be studied in some greater depth than they are now. I think that the abduction phenomena should be taken out of the hands of the UFO investigators. One reason for this is because I have had individuals come to me with their abduction stories who later have attempted suicide because they felt that the aliens were watching them too intently and their lives were being controlled.
While most victims of these abductions see their aggressors as threats from outer space, scientists like Professor Alvin Lawson at the University of California have serious reservations about believing the stories, and with good reason. In 1977, Lawson conducted a significant experiment with a group of students. Placed under hypnosis, his students who had no prior history of an abduction were told to imagine being abducted and taken aboard a UFO.
The Alvin Lawson study was a fascinating experiment to try and find out how easily it is to influence one's beliefs and perceptions. He took a group of individuals who believed that they had been abducted by UFOs, recorded some of their experiences, then took a group who had no memory of this, did not believe perhaps, and did not have a history of being abducted by aliens that they had recollected. And then he implanted a hypnotic suggestion in them that they had been abducted by aliens. And when they compared the two groups, there were some similarities, but a number of differences as well. And it suggested that hypnosis, when used with abductees, can generate some false impressions, especially if the hypnosis is conducted by individuals who themselves have a bias in the belief or disbelief in aliens.
The results of Lawson's experiment were poorly received by UFO researchers, and for a good reason. They showed that the UFO phenomenon is so present in the media that it has literally become ingrained in the minds of the masses. As a result, a person doesn't have to have experienced a genuine alien abduction to be able to imagine one with realistic detail. In a multimedia society such as ours, it's impossible for a person to claim that they have never heard of UFOs. In television and movies alone, there are countless examples of alien appearances, from The Simpsons to McDonald's commercials.
As for the use of hypnosis as an investigative tool, it is becoming more and more controversial. Contrary to the concept that has been widely spread, hypnosis is not a magic path to the truth. Objectively speaking, there is no surefire method for testing the accuracy of statements made under hypnosis.
If anyone thinks that because a person is in a hypnotic state, that what they say is therefore true and accurate, that is totally mistaken.
Of the other alien abduction victims, the ones who have walked away with a conscious recollection of their experience have never brought back proof to support their story. Some experts have spoken of strange-looking implants, a sort of GPS system used by aliens to track their victims in case they move.
One of the pieces of physical evidence that has been claimed for abductions are implants. And these are very small objects in hands, in feet, on the back, in the shoulder, that the witness says was not there in advance of the abduction memory. And under certain circumstances where they are retrieved, they turn out to be little bits of metal shavings. Sometimes they are glass, sometimes wood, sometimes bits of calcified material. The suggestion is that the aliens are tracking them with these devices. The trouble is that because we don't have good records, an alien abductee has not been x-rayed in advance of the discovery of this, we have no way of tracing when and where this object may have got there.
UFO appearances have been feeding the media for 60 years. Unfortunately, the subject is of little interest to academic institutions. And what is sad is that it has been ridiculed so much over the years that to show more than a passing interest is equivalent to professional suicide.
In 1997, tired of all the nonsense circulating about UFOs, American millionaire Lawrence S. Rockefeller, who was interested in the subject, approached the country's top scientific authorities and asked them, "Why aren't you studying UFOs?" The answer was a resounding, "Because we aren't paid to study them." Their answer clearly shows the major problem with scientific research: no funding, no research. So the millionaire agreed to pay them. For 5 days, from September 29th to October 4th, 1997, these scientists were paid to sit on a panel whose purpose was to determine whether or not UFOs were of interest to the science community. Rockefeller invited the greatest UFO experts on the planet to come and present their best cases.
When the meeting was over, the group of scientists gathered by Rockefeller, who had for the most part been skeptical about UFOs, changed their position. They all agreed that while the cases did not prove the existence of extraterrestrial visits, they did present many elements that could not be explained by science. Hence, they were of some interest.
One of the more interesting results of this particular project was that scientists were listening to the ufologists, and where they were talking about some of the classic cases, some of the more interesting cases that had some significant evidence. The scientists were not disagreeing that the cases existed. In fact, they were very interested in what was reported. And it was the fact that they were actually listening to one another and not talking at cross purposes that produced the most interesting results.
UFOs. Are they merely a modern myth fed by pop culture, or real visits by extraterrestrials? It would seem that convincing proof is flagrantly lacking. But, as the saying goes, absence of proof is not proof of absence.
La preuve de l'absence.